You're the only person I know that's actually had COVID-19. And
we should say that this is right after Easter. So we're in early April 2020, because when things start changing this fast from one week to the next, I think it's a good idea to let people who listen to this conversation and take part in it know exactly when this conversation happened.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is early April 2020, just right after Easter. Yeah. I had COVID-19. I had my bad week last week.
Yeah. And you're out of hospital. You went there briefly and you're okay. And we're all very happy that you're okay.
Yeah.
Because, I was a little bit worried there for.
Well, I'm 59 years old. So for men who are over 50, and I have asthma, if you're over 50 and you belong to one of the risk groups, you should actually expect a pretty hard beating when you get it. So it's not going to be one of those sweet asymptomatic versions of it. But the older you get, the harder the beating gets. The good thing, though, when you look at the numbers coming in from Europe now, early April, is that very few people below 60 die from this disease and get as bad as they're close to dying. So ventilators work if you're younger, if you need them. Oxygen definitely works if you need it. But you can get a hard beating. And I knew that when it happened. I never felt scared or anything. I had about 48 hours that were critical to me. Great friends around me. Peter I lived with was wonderful. Doctors and nurses were just so professional. And they'd already seen so many men my age that they could tell right away where my problem was. And they helped me differentiate between what is eerie and weird about it and what is actually dangerous, which is what's important to know, right? So there are a couple of things that are truly dangerous. The other things, even if they hurt or they're uncomfortable, you can just ignore them. That was all I needed to know at that stage, and then I felt fine. And a couple of days later, I realized that, okay, that was the deepest it's probably going to get. It will be shaky right from now on, but I'm terrific.
Great. Okay. Yeah. You sound good. So the last time we talked a little bit about coronavirus, and we didn't have too much to say about what was really going on, because perhaps we didn't know yet. Is there anything you want to say about that, about what patterns we're seeing, what's going on, what's, on let's say on the level of, just society's reaction to this thing, and your concern with, the digital, the fact that we're living in a digital age, and when a pandemic comes. Oh
yeah. It's okay.
Everything.
Let's go with the timeless stuff. Number one thing, even if I had a bad COVID-19 last week, I can assure you that the damage done by the crisis itself and the current hysteria is going to be way, way worse than the disease itself. Mm-hmm. We're probably going to arrive at a disease that kills at most 0.2% of the people who are affected by it. And most people will be affected by it. I don't think we'll have a vaccine in years. So I think the countries that are now slowly moving towards herd immunity are actually making the clever moves. This is April 2020 again.
Like Sweden.
And realize that sooner or later, this probably has to sort of flush through the general population. Let's just save the 80-year-olds and older as much as we can and make them stay away, because they will not transfer the virus from one another if there's no virus around. So we could probably have the luxury of saving the people who are at most risk, but the other ones of us in society, the 70 or 80% needed to reach herd immunity, the younger and healthy people need probably to go through this for us to arrive in a good place and we can say it's over. But having said that, that's just pandemiology. We know pandemics from before. They have happened on this scale. They happen about 7 or 8 times every century. So we should have been much better prepared. We should have expected this. The countries that did have SARS 15 years ago were much better prepared than the countries that would be lucky enough not to have seen this for the last 30 years. So we had these pandemics in the 1950s and the 1960s. They killed far more people than the coronavirus has done now. So what is the difference yet? Well, we have arrived in the internet age, starting in the 1980s. And there are now cameras everywhere, there are microphones everywhere, and we've got 8 billion people on the planet more or less connected through the smartphones and laptops to having their own megaphones, screaming at the top of their lungs about anything they react to. So we have sort of a massive reaction across the world with tons of conspiracy theories and all kinds of weird shit going on when people speak their minds and fantasize about what's happening. And this has made the pandemic way worse than it could have been if you just kept it as a pandemic and treated it that way. We're spending far too much energy on the hysteria than we should, and we're not spending enough energy still on the pandemic that we should. That's the problem. So we're now living in an age where we need to be confronted with that the lesson to be learned afterwards from 2020, what was that we live in an age of hysteria. We live in an age of mass psychosis. So that's going to be a major problem that we need to solve. Of course, we all learn from previous experiences. We can all, if something like this happens in the future, we can all go back and say, well, we did that in 2020. And those things were the right things that we did, but those things were the terrible things that we did. Those things were the ones that actually were constructive in the long run. And those ideas that we have are terrible, right?
Like, what's the difference? Okay.
Like, so I think the hysteria, what we're going to do eventually, that the ultimate judgment of the spring of 2020 is going to be that we're way too hysterical for our own good. The hysteria didn't do us much well. But that's exactly the problem. Now when everybody has cameras...
When the Hong Kong flu came or whatever in the 60s, millions of people died, and this didn't happen. This kind of shutdown of everything and economic collapse didn't happen.
Exactly. So
what should have happened? What should be happening? Like what...
Well, we talk a lot about logos and mythos and pathos, you and I, right? And the problem with pathos is that it is when the gods strike you. So that's when you're being hit by a thunderbolt, something like that. That is definitely pathos. Pathos belongs to what Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis called the real. And it's actually also what Rene Girard talks a lot about when he talks about mimetics. So it is what we hide in our subconsciousness. It is what nature hides from us. But that strikes us when we're worst prepared. And it sort of corrects us and brings us back to reality in the sense that, oh my God, I live within a nature that I cannot control. There's no harmony in nature. There's no balance in nature. Nature isn't fair. Nature doesn't really care about us as human beings. That means if we're worst prepared, which we were now in most countries, then we get a much worse pandemic. That is, of course, the pathic lesson to be learned. So the pathic narrative here is quite simple. It is Jacques Lacan's, the real strikes you. It did with September 11. It did with the Lehman Brothers banking crisis 12 years ago. And it did so now again, even worse, because this time around it was the chaos goddess herself, it was nature itself that struck us. So that's the pathic narrative involved in this. But the problem is, instead of going from the pathic narrative towards logos, which is like, okay, how do we then solve the problem? Okay, what resources do we have since we came so ill prepared? So how do we minimize deaths? How do we push the transmit of this virus forward from as many people as possible, so we can start handling it before actually the general population gets hit? You know, how do we optimize whatever resource we have to minimize the damage done?
Seems like this is a crisis of authority. It's like, who has the authority to make decisions?
This is the point. No. The hysteria means we didn't go from pathos to logos. We went from pathos to mythos. So what happened was that media took over this. And what media always do, they're totally mythical. Media will always put the journalist where the storm looks the worst. So if a journalist is covering a hurricane, he will try to find the one angle where the hurricane looks absolutely worst, like this is the most damage done. So even if most of a town has been completely, unaffected by a hurricane, the journalist will always stand in front of the building where it looks like it blows the hardest and where most damage has been done.
Yeah, so we're
great drama,
pictures
right?
of people in the hospital dying of.
Oh yeah, when we got those pictures from Italy, and it looked like the plague had returned, and people were dying everywhere, and they weren't covered, and the doctors and the nurses were dying, and we heard these stories about the crematorias working 24 hours a day, and mass graves, and all of this the media created was mythos. It's not that not all of it wasn't a lie. Part of it was certainly true, but the way it was portrayed was as a huge sensation. We live in more than ever in the society of the spectacle. And this is what media does. Media thrives on selling newspapers and selling web pages and selling ads and whatever they're selling. And all they want to do, they have no other incentive. Selling drama. They have no other incentive. They have no incentive at all to tell us the truth. Then, of course, the media pushes the politicians and pulls the politicians away from logos where they should be. Thankfully, epidemiologists, doctors and nurses, scientists out there, statisticians, people like me who do like complexity studies. I've been involved in this in Scandinavia. All the people who can understand a pandemic like this from a logical perspective are also pulled in. But we're quickly being silenced when the politicians are pulled away from the logos into the mythos. And that's when the voters go, you got to do something. You got to do something symbolic. You got to look like you react, even if it's not the right thing to do. So, for example, we knew early on that kids would not get this disease. Kids don't die from COVID-19. They hardly ever get sick. Yeah. And still, we closed schools all over Europe. Now, why do we do that for? Because you want to protect the kids if we got an epidemic? Yes. But if the epidemic doesn't affect kids, well, then we don't want to hear that because we want to react in the way we normally do.
Well, because they can still spread the disease, right? The kids?
But they do that even more. What happened in Italy was you took the kids out of school. They went home and gave it to the granddad. And the granddad got sick and died. This is the tragedy when the politicians refuse to stay within the realm of logos. Because the only way you have to accept the pathic narrative. That's the narrative from the gods. And the narrative from the gods is always, you believed in harmony and balance. You believed you were protected. You believed there would always be some kind of father or mother figure out there to protect you. Bullshit. The world is contingent. Disasters like this happen. Politicians were not prepared. The system wasn't working. It had tons of blind spots in it. You couldn't handle this at all. And by the way, it's a virus. We don't even know how it operates. So this contingent virus spreads rapidly through the population. Media moves the whole narrative into the realm of mythos, and we arrive with the mythical narrative. And when you're going to look back at this 6 months or 12 months from now, I can swear the countries that handle this the best, this is like a culture test, huge culture test. The countries that handle this the best, even when you compare the data, they moved into logical narrative and stayed there. So far, it's looking very much like Germany, Japan, possibly New Zealand. They're also lucky because they're an island. Taiwan, same thing. But the countries so far that have the lowest number of death cases, well, they have to eventually move towards herd immunity. But since they do it later than everybody else, at least they did better than everybody else did. Okay. The people who didn't react to that, the people that had sensationalist media dominating the landscape and pulled the politicians into that realm, like Belgium, which is the big disaster zone in Europe right now, early April, those countries had way more damage, way more deaths, way more sick people, way more fighting over ventilators, way more disaster than anybody else. So if you stay within the logos in the middle of a crisis, you will always be better off than if you jump onto the mythos. Because mythos is not what you need when you're in the middle of a crisis. This is a perfect example of how logos and mythos and pathos serve different purposes. But as human beings, we very often mix them up.
So mythos should just be out of the way, at this point?
Yeah. Kids had nothing to do with this to begin with. People have said that we need to talk to the kids and tell them what's going on. No, just get the kids out of the way. Send them back to school. That's what Sweden did. Keep the kids in school, because if you keep the kids in school, you get way more nurses who don't have to stay at home with the kids who can actually still go to work and save people's lives, right? The police force here in Scandinavia, the nurses, the doctors said, please, keep our kids at school, because then we can still go to work. If you close down the schools, we have to take care of the kids. I also have to leave the kids with the grandparents, which means risking the grandparents' life. We knew early in this pandemic that it was all about the grandparents and the retirement homes. We knew that early on, and still, even here in Sweden, they messed up about the retirement homes, and that's where the vast majority of people are dying right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's what we should have protected. We should have locked down all of society. We should have just put a ring around the retirement homes, try to save the lives of the elderly for a few months, to keep them away, and then let this virus move through society. That's what we should have done. Any epidemiologist would say that that's what should have been done all along. But instead, people went for this massive lockdown. Alcohol consumption is up. Violence in homes is up. People are becoming unemployed. The mess we're going to have to clean up, the sort of socio-economic crisis we're going to be in Europe by July and August is going to be absolutely massive. And I expect that the European Union is going to take a hard beating and probably fall apart, definitely the euro. So we're going to have huge crisis. We already have this almost civil war in Europe between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. It's already started. Right in the middle of crisis, already started. And it's all about who's going to pay for all of this.
Yeah. Oh, well.
We're printing money like mad. And at the end of the day, somebody's got to pay for it. And if there's one thing we need to tell the kids, to be honest about, is that the current model says that we're printing the money to save our assets, to save the economy, save our own lives. You know, if you get unemployed, you might go and kill yourself for that reason rather than let a virus do it for you. So to minimize the current damage, we need to calm down and get the hysteria out of the way as quickly as possible and go back to normal. Because we can't handle the lockdown situation for much longer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, when are people going to start rioting on the streets? I don't know, but
America's a mess already, right?
Crazy in inside their own private little worlds. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would expect, this is a guess, qualified guess from a complexity theorist, but it's a guess. We're early April. I would say places like Russia, Turkey, Algeria, Brazil, Indonesia. Countries we used to call emerging market countries. They can afford to give antibiotics to people, and they've probably done it way too much. So they've got a major antibiotics resistance problem. But there's still, the vast majority of people who move to the middle classes are still poor, and they have no health protection to speak of. That means there's a small minority of wealthy people who will buy their own ventilators to secure that they're fine. And everybody else will be left behind in those countries. That's where the biggest mess will be created, and I expect the most political upheaval. But it could get really messy in America and Europe too. This is probably the most drastic economic crisis we're going into since 1929, and we know from previous periods in history that's going to get messy and could go violent.
Is this? Are we heading into a great kind of depression, or are we heading into more like totalitarian social control? Are we heading into is there some kind of possibility for, let's say, anything good to come out of this? Some kind of like
what? Wait here. The longer we stay within mythos, the worse it gets.
So maybe
the sooner we move over to logos, the better it gets. And this is where Jordan Peterson would agree with me. The authentic phallus is logical. So logos is with the authentic phallus. Whereas the false phallus, the false leader who steps forward, is mythical. That's why the false phallus will unite us by just pointing out the virus, of course, as an object, which is correct. That's, after all, a perfect object. But then move that object onto somebody else. So it's happening already in China here, early April. They're going after Russians, and they're going after Africans. They're going after anybody who doesn't look like a Chinese person these days in China. So ironically, all the virus originated from China. Now the Chinese are objectifying people who are not Chinese. Objectifying. Please remember that. That is false phallic behavior. And false phallic behavior is mythical. It doesn't stay with the truth. It creates.
Well, I guess racism is mythical, or
exactly. Racism is racism is the perfect sample of something bad mythical, right? It's just bad mythos. So, because obviously when you look at race, it doesn't even exist. It's just damn skin color. Nothing else is different between human beings because we're all the same. So logos is what reminds you that racism is incorrect, and mythos is what racism thrives on. So again, we need to get the mythos out of the way. And I don't think the major newspapers and the big TV channels and anything like that at all have any credibility in this. They are more responsible for the mythical misrepresentation of the pandemic and the crisis than anybody else out there, because they only get attention these days and get viewers and get their ads sold and shit like that if they get as much attention as possible to what they say, and they thrive on sensation and spectacle. You cannot trust them at all. It's possible New York Times is better than the average blog. But again, the only way to get a properly logical understanding of what's going on is to find at least 5 different news sources and then match them against each other and then make up your own mind.
Okay.
Logos is always scientific.
Okay, so you mentioned scapegoating.
Yeah.
And you were talking about a theory of memetic phenomenology in your last letter you sent me.
That's a good term.
So I think I want you to elaborate on that. I want you to
yeah, it's a new idea.
We're
possibly including in the new book. We're working on it, as you know. The deeper we dig into mimesis, and it's you and me and Thomas Hammerich that really are having these conversations, sort of off Zoom. in between each other. And we should have Thomas and record stuff with him too, because he has a lot of great stuff to say on this. And he studied Girard very deeply. And if you study Eliade, Girard, and the great anthropologists of the 20th century, and you discover actually that mimesis is so fundamental to nature. It's both instinct, it's drive, it's definitely desire, mimetic desire. It could even possibly be part of transcendence too. I mean, all the different four drives you talk about in our psychoanalytical version of drives has mimesis in it. Mimesis is so prevalent everywhere. And mimesis is essentially just what we do as kids. We see somebody do something and we just mimic them. We try to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then we might do our own little personal version of it, but we still mimic what other people do. And Rene Girard's fundamental idea is that mimesis is so grounded in us that we also mimic our own desires. So we look at what somebody else wants, and we have a fantasy about what they want, and we make it our own desire. So he wants that. He wants a red sports car. Then I want a red sports car, and then we cover that over. And we firmly believe that we find out for ourselves that we want a red sports car.
Yeah, or we're attracted to a woman or a man because we're attracted to them. Whereas if somebody else is involved, that third person will make that person seem, exponentially more attractive. If there's
it rhymes with Freud. Do you remember how we were during the Oedipus complex and Lecter complex? Are they were 1-year-olds? We mimic our parents, and as a boy, you want to marry your mom, and your mom laughs at you, and she goes off and fucks your dad. And you realize you can't have your mom. You can't have your mom that way. You had her tit for a year, and she gave birth to you, but you can never have her the way dad has. And the mystery of how dad conquers mom possesses us.
Yeah.
So we mimic him.
Yeah.
We mimic him simply because he becomes an idol. He has some magical quality that we don't understand, which is, of course, sexuality. And as kids, we don't understand that. So we mimic him, and we mimic him, and we mimic him in hope that we one day can be like him. And then one day we discover we cannot be like him, and we give up on that because our penis grows and our vaginas grow, and suddenly we become grown-ups, and we are adolescents, and suddenly we have to deal with our teenage years, and that's, of course, the teenage rebellion, which, of course, is called the rebellion against the phallus. We break with the father. We don't want his stick, neither inside of us or between our legs. So we become young men and young women. And then we still mimic, because then we have to make our own version of what father and mother were. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is just mimicking again. Mm-hmm. So as grown-ups, we mimic the priest. And the priest, we assume, mimic the lesser gods. Mm-hmm. And then we assume that the lesser gods mimic the higher god.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just like we just skip it. It's like viruses. It's just like we push it forward,
so there's
not to deal with it.
Of mimesis.
Yeah, mm-hmm. So that we undisturbedly can mimic what we're obsessed with mimicking at the moment. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do.
And one of the important things about that dynamic is that we hide it from ourselves, that we're actually doing it.
Exactly. Right? Now, remember how eerily reminiscent this sounds when you compare to Jacques Lacan's psychoanalysis and the real? Mm-hmm. That the real is something we hide all the time because we're obsessed with the symbolic and the imaginary. So the imaginary or the emotional is what we feel and what we make up, our fantasy about the world that we make up. The symbolic is how we then put language onto that and names it and gives word to things. And then we believe that the way we talk about something or make art about it, or the way we use language about it, is reality. Okay, that's a symbolic reality that we invent. And we have the symbolic and the imaginary, and we jump in between these two until we fool ourselves into believing that we understand the world and that the world dances according to our wishes, because it dances between the imaginary and the symbolic. And then suddenly, boom! God comes into the picture. The pathos comes into the picture. Nature returns with a vengeance and reminds us that, oops, no, not at all. And inside of us, the nature inside of us, the real in Lacan, is of course what mimesis is. Mm-hmm. Since Girard says that we hide mimesis all the time. And I should credit Thomas Hammerich for actually seeing the distinction here and seeing the similarity. There might be other guys out there who compared Lacan and Girard in the same way. But that's definitely the way to read Girard. And that's also why it becomes problematic that Girard then says that as soon as we start mimicking, and two guys mimic the same thing, which we are very likely to do, then rivalry starts. Mm-hmm. And the question we're looking into now is, Was rivalry a major problem already in the sociant, in the original tribes, as it was a smaller community where everybody's more or less related to each other? Or did rivalry explode when we started settling in larger settlements? And that's exactly what we had to invent organized religion. That is a very, very, very interesting fundamental question. Girard never looked into it. When Girard
Are you sure about that? It seems to me that in early tribes, there's a lot of rivalry between, a lot of fighting going on between.
No, Girard never talks about nomadic tribes. It's Gilles Deleuze who does that in parallel with Girard. So you've got to take Deleuze work on nomadology and Deleuze work on the difference between being nomadic and settled, which is of course Zoroastrianism. You got to read Deleuze next to Girard, next to Lacan, to see the bigger picture. Because Girard moves all the way back to Christ, and
he goes further back. He talks a lot about the early tribes and
they're all settled in Girard. Remember that when we talk about early tribes, are they settled or are they on the move? The fundamental difference here is not that there's a tribe. The fundamental difference is not that it's older than Christianity. The fundamental difference is, do you discuss people who settled in the river valleys or in the mountains somewhere? So they're settled. The big difference for human beings over the last 200,000 years is only one shift. Went from nomadic to settled.
Okay.
We're still dealing with that shit. We're still dealing with the fact that we settled down. We're still dealing with the fact that we have to travel in our ideas, and we need to go to the gym every day to get exercise, because otherwise we get killed for viruses, that's for sure. So, we deal with the fact that we decided to settle down 10,000 years ago, and increasingly did so because we could breed more children and grow larger populations because of it. And only because the populations got larger when we settled, that model won. We didn't pick that model. We didn't choose it. But we did. So we've got a model where we were constantly nomadically on the move in a physical landscape. And what Zoroaster dealt with uniquely when he invented the only major idea besides nomadology ever, which is eventology. When Zoroaster invented eventology 3,700 years ago, 1700 before Christ in Persia, when Zoroaster invented that idea, he basically said, nomadology will keep on running because we're still on the move, but we got to move in the world of ideas.
Okay.
Because now we're settled. Especially men need to do that. Men need to move in the world of ideas because now they're settled. That means you're out and about doing warfare and hunting and shit like that, but you're always returning to the same point, which is the inner circle where the women and the children are. And that's where your future and heritage is. That's where your sexuality is. That's where all the things that you invest in are. That's the delivery station. So no matter how much you fight, we talked about that. You go to war or you go hunting as a man to then go back to the delivery station and prove you're worth it, right? So that's the matriarchy you go back to. And the patriarchy is basically the organization of warfare and hunting. Okay, outer circuit, inner circuit. So the inner circuit settled. And because the inner circuit settled, we settled as humanity. Some fat, lazy woman sat down 8,000 years ago in Babylon, and we haven't moved ever since. Okay, so then Zoroaster says we got to move in the world of ideas. And the way to move in the world of ideas is to move along the time axis rather than in physical space. So he moves the focus away from physical space, where Plato and the other guys stayed all along and dreamed about perfection, and moved us over to process philosophy and process thinking and constant movement. This is why Heraclitus is Zoroastrian. Heraclitus says that everything changes, everything is in flux. That's the fundamental aspect of reality. Flux itself is fundamental. So that's what Zoroaster says too. But he says along the time axis, dramatic things can happen at certain points in time that we call events. And these events can change history forever. Now, if Girard had gone all the way back to nomadology and Zoroaster's eventology, which he never did, he would have looked at Christ a bit differently, because Christ is the ultimate event to Christians. That Girard would agree on. But Girard would see more than the final scapegoat in Christ, because he's the final scapegoat in a Christian fantasy. Jews beg to differ. 2,000 years of pogroms certainly proved that this wasn't the last.
Well, the Jews would say every Jew is the suffering Christ, or
Well, to begin with, if the Christians say, like Girard says that, well, the hope of Christianity was that by putting Christ on the cross, we had the final scapegoat. We don't need any more scapegoats, and we can start controlling the lynch mobs and make people more civilized. And that's correct. Religion is all about civilizing and domesticating people to be less wild and violent. That's what religion is all about. That's true. That was been the Christian ambition. Sometimes Christianity has been successful at it. Sometimes it has failed. I'm just saying that the Jews can certify that the pogroms they've been thrown at them for the past 2,000 years prove that Christianity failed miserably when it comes to containing the lynch mobs. But anyway, that was the goal of Christianity. I agree with Girard. That makes sense. You took this cocky Gnostic guy called Jesus Christ. He was put on the cross, and no matter what he said or what he did during his life, he was the perfect ultimate scapegoat on that cross, young and handsome, hanging on the cross in a rebellion against the Roman Empire, to create the idea of some kind of universal religion without a state. And that's exactly what Paul and Augustine did with Christianity. So that makes sense. But if you go back further, what is it that Christianity mimics? And Girard doesn't address the question of what Christianity mimics. Freud does that. And Freud does that in Moses and Monotheism, which also is not included in Girard's work. That was Freud's last book in the late 1930s, when Freud went into the deepest, darkest secrets of his own mind and dug deep into Jewish history, right when Hitler was starting attacking the Jews in Europe. This was the late 1930s. And Freud wrote a beautiful book called Moses and Monotheism and started tracing Judaism all the way back to Egypt and the Akhenaten period, the period of Atenism, a brief period of monotheistic dictatorship in Egypt. And probably Tutankhamun was used eventually as a precursor to Christ. He was also probably a silly guy. In this case, he was probably incestoid freak or something, but he was killed by the priest, just like Christ was later. So about 1700 years before Christ is killed, Tutankhamun is killed in Egypt. And it's a very, very likely starting point for an post-Atenist monotheistic cult in Egypt that eventually leaves Egypt through an exodus led by Moses. And no matter who led the Exodus about 1,000 years before Christ, that's like 300 years after Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, that's the date of the Exodus out of Egypt. It probably happened, Moses led it, and later, in contact with the Zoroastrians, the Jews rewrote this story when they were in Babylon as an original Egyptian sect in Babylon. When they met with the Persians, they rewrote the story and turned it into a nomadology with Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The three siblings, which is exact replica of nomadology. So they mimic nomadology, and they then had their savior, the original founding savior of the faith. So if Abraham didn't kill Isaac, then the priest instead killed Tutankhamun, and Judaism kickstarts from there. This is speculation, but it's a very, very likely starting point for Judaism. It was then, of course, immersed with Canaanite religion, which was a rich religion full of all kinds of ideas. It had polytheistic and monotheistic aspect. But the comparison between Judaism and Zoroastrianism is striking, is that they have a split phallus. We talked about this before. Yep. It's not a unified phallus because that's Adolf Hitler and that's Akhenaten. You avoid having a dictator and you avoid fundamentalism within a religion by having a split phallus, by separating chieftain and priest. Okay, Zoroastrianism did this. Judaism clearly did this. That's why I have this close connection between Persian and Jewish culture. Yeah, this close connection, and eventually that led to two of the most amazing innovations in human history. The Persians invented the empire, and the Jews invented the nation.
Right.
And they're both religious constructions. It's the non-separation of church and state that's key here. Both church and state are under religion and are religious institutions. But the state is led by the emperor, and the church is led by the priest or the Mobed in Persia. And the Jews did the same thing with Judaism. So you unify the people by declaring the religion of the nation to be the same thing. And in Zoroastrianism, you unify the empire with the religion by making it a superior religion, higher in the hierarchy. And below that religion, you can have any iconology you like. That's exactly why the Persians invented universal human rights, freedom of speech, tolerance, and diversity and plurality, because plurality operates on different levels in a hierarchy. Then they even split the higher hierarchy to make sure it didn't feel too superior into a military and a priestly religion. And in Persian history, that is Mithraism, that even the Roman Empire turned into its military religion, interesting enough. So Mithraism was the military religion, both of the Persians and the Romans. And in the Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism, the ultimate form of dark mysticism, became the religion of the priests. So Zoroastrianism and Judaism kept the Bard absolute. You and I talk so much about. They even made it even firmer,
whereas
realizing it was even more needed.
Christians opened up the floodgates.
The Christians and the Muslims opened it up. So the way to look at Christianity is the infantile mimicry of Judaism in a fundamental sense, because it has universal aspirations for something that can only work on a national level. And Islam did the same thing. Islam then became, sorry to say this, but the popular infantile mimicry of Zoroastrianism. Then Islam and Christianity took over the world, and we can honor them for whatever they did or successes they had the last 2,000 years or 1,500 years. But I think it's time now when we look back to all of history and go back and revalue the Axial Age and go back and find that the real gemstones are from the Bronze Age and are from the Axial Age. The real great ideas are 3,000, 4,000 years old rather than 1,500 years old. When we start removing what I call the pillar saints, the saints sitting on the pillars, what do you call them in English? You say these guys.
Pillared saints?
Pillar. So like guys who sit on the pillar and he thinks he's like divine and he thinks he's a guru, right? There's a Germanic word for it, but it probably doesn't exist in English language. We've got to find that out. So we can involve the people who watch this and say that Pelar Helgon is Swedish if you read Swedish. Okay. This is the guy besides the boy pharaoh that I'm going to murder in the new book, right? And they come through at the Axial Age and they sit on their they sit in, out in the forest and they sit and think they're so fucking wonderful and amazing because they're little mummy's boys and they know the truth about everything. And they're called things like Plato and they're all Gnostics. And that's the problem I have, because the reason why Jews and especially Zoroastrians are so aggressive against Gnosticism is that you got to have a unified worldview where you separate the phallus, and you separate the phallus in turn from the matriarchy. But that's how you unify the three and thereby unify the tribe, and you unify the nation, and you unify the empire. And the only ideas we have today that we can take from history on how we could possibly get along, the only original ideas we have, the only eventological ideas we have, is the Jewish innovation of the nation, sponsored by the Persians, and it's the Persian innovation of the empire. And all other empires like the Chinese and the Indian empires and the Roman empires and today the American empire, or whatever you like, are imitations of the original Persian empire, more or less successfully so. The American Constitution is a perfect example of something that's taken straight out of the Persian empire and works wonderfully. But the problem we have is that we also have a nationalism that we should cherish, and that's the Jewish one. And I think the countries today that are doing fine, like Japan, are mimicking the same system. Japan has Shintoism, which is the religion of the military and the chieftains, and they've got Buddhism, which is the religion of what we would call the priestly class. And those two religions operate in parallel. You don't necessarily need religion for women in that case. You can have one if you like. In China, they got three. So they probably turned Buddhism into something more matriarchal. They keep Taoism as the priest religion. And then they turn Confucianism into the organization of society, which is always where you find the chieftain, the king, those characters. So we see that these systems are very stable over time. But what we need today is to go back to the actual sources, take back religion. In China's case, it means that the way out of the current predicament with the Chinese communist dictatorship is to remove atheism from the Chinese constitution, look at communism itself as one religion among many others, which is perfectly okay, and then start looking at the possibility of a split phallus we can find in Chinese culture. And to me, that is put Taoism and Confucianism against each other. And that would create a perfect political system of at least two parties.
Yeah.
That would be China learning from America, ironically, but it's actually learning from the Persian Empire and creating a system that's way more stable over time than the current communist dictatorship, because China is going to run totally amok and arrive in havoc. It almost did with the
Well, I think that was Chinese culture, wasn't it? For thousands of years. It was a balance of Taoism and Confucius.
Yes. That's when it was stable. So you will discover that any stable empire over time, including the United States today, any stable empire time has a structure that is a triad. There's a delivery station called the matriarchy that you deliver to. That's all women need. They have that foundation which you come from, where you return to when you die. It's mortitudinal, and it holds you responsible for your actions, and it's the delivery station, but it's also where children are born and where heritage is created. So your transcendence is completely dependent on the matriarchy working. The way a matriarchy works is that it then holds the two phallic functions responsible for doing their shit. And that means men need to split up between the guys that have brilliant minds, and we call them priests, and who have brilliant bodies, and we call them chieftains. And those are the guys we look up to as men, and they should admire each other, but have separate courts and separate capitals and separate power systems and do not interfere with one another. That's what the Persians discovered. This is what Zoroaster Vishtaspa discovered in Persia 3,700
How
years
separate
ago.
should they be? Should they not,
As separate as you are when you admire another man for having the strengths that are your weaknesses. But also allow him to admire you for having your strengths that are his weaknesses.
Okay.
And whatever distance is required to maintain that admiring relationship without going into rivalry is perfect. Because this is where you want the Cain and the Abels. You want to avoid them. The reason why we have all these mythical stories in Judaism, in Zoroastrianism, in Christianity, in Islam, everywhere about the rivalrous brothers when we want to avoid the rivalry, is because the rivalry, if the rivalry goes all the way up to the top, and the rivalry is between the chieftain and the priest, sooner or later one of them will become the dictator and the tyrant. And he will only rule for a short time. But he will cause enormous havoc while he does that.
That's important, then. That's like, that's very interesting.
Dictators don't last, but they cause enormous havoc when they do.
Yeah, well, we all know how bad dictators are, but what we don't know how to do very well is to keep those two from becoming rivals.
Yeah, there are two ways to look at it. And there was actually Peter Towson, who I know I work with and love, that he came up with this second one because, I've been working a lot with the Peter Pan syndrome because it's so dominant in culture today. It's a very American phenomenon. So the Peter Pan syndrome is essentially that you're 11 years old, your dick has just started growing, and you want to have the power of the dick, but you don't want to take the responsibility of being an adult man. So you're trying to play tricks to keep the benefits of being a boy and trade them and still get the benefits of being a man and keep them within the same body. Platonists and Gnostics do this all the time. Yeah. They might be terrified of the big dick. They might be terrified of being grown-ups to begin with, but they try to trade and get the benefits out of this and then impress their moms and other women by moving out of society, become pacifists, vegans, and all kinds of things they do. They're always more noble. They're always nicer, whereas the rest of us men who go out there and do our duty, we're evil, right? So these guys are noble and fantastic. So Zoroaster hated them with a vengeance, right? So this is the problem we got. So Peter Pan syndrome is so prevalent in culture today because we fucked it up bad with Hitler, Stalin, and the atomic bomb in 1945. We were so shocked of phallic power and the fake phalluses that caused havoc and killed 100 million people on the planet that we were just in complete lockdown, mental lockdown, 1945. Women had started going into the labor market and said, we better work on our own and get paid for it because we don't trust men any longer. Understandable, very understandable in 1945. After 1945, we go into the kind of deadlock that created postmodernism and created the current society where women stepped in and took leadership roles, but they're confused because the men have retreated and disappeared from view. So the phallic power no longer exists. And that means young men are trained to become Peter Pan syndrome, whether they like it or not. And that's why Peter Pan syndrome has become so prevalent. Now, Peter Pan syndrome is perfectly what Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, these guys were when they were kids before they became dictators.
Yeah. Sort of like the Uber manipulator.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So when Adolf Hitler was refused to go to art school because he lacked talent, he became a fierce, manic dictator, and eventually he wanted to take revenge of the Jewish professors who turned him down at art school, and he did it by killing 7 million Jews, right? Okay, that's what Peter Pan guys do. They're terrible, right? Pol Pot, Cambodia, Peter Pan syndrome. But what Peter said to me, Towson said to me, was that, well, there should be an opposite reaction too. Wait a second, what do you mean? Well, Peter Pan syndrome is like the neurosis here, but there should be kind of a psychotic reaction too. There should be a guy who was actually perfectly healthy, mentally healthy, But he grew up in an environment that was so fucked up that he became fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
And we started looking, and then Peter said, how about Caligula? You got it. Caligula's story, yeah. Father killed, mother killed, all these intrigues, the courts of Rome. The guy was sent to an evil uncle called Tiberius, who was one of the most evil men ever. This guy, Caligula, must have been so terrified of absolutely everybody when he grew up, so that when he was 11, 12 years old and his dick started growing, he could not trust absolutely anybody in the world. And if you're absolutely paranoid when you become a grown-up man, there's no rite of passage for you anywhere because you cannot trust anybody. You're absolutely paranoid for all the right reasons.
Yeah.
And suddenly somebody tells you you're the king of the world. What the fuck do? You kill everybody.
You create a living hell, yeah.
You create living hell. And that's why Caligula is such an interesting character. Again,
he's a different type than Hitler, you would say.
I honor Towson for being so Hegelian. It's a perfect example of just reversing the Peter Pan syndrome. The Peter Pan syndrome is an internal problem. Like it's a guy we have a problem with with the psychopathic personality that, if we're unlucky, gets power way too early in his life and then causes havoc. That's the Peter Pan syndrome. Mm-hmm. That's Robespierre. That's Hitler, that's Pol Pot, that's Mao, that's Stalin, lots of these evil guys. Akhenaten certainly into
Caligula is maybe more like the American Psycho or something.
Yes. So he must be considered absolutely sane. But because his Umwelt, his context, is absolutely crazy, he goes crazy. This is the kind of evil that Plato could not foresee. But we can. Because we're Aristotelian.
I still haven't got it yet.
You got to move from Plato to Aristotle. You got to see Aristotle constantly reminding Plato that everything is about context. It's where the idea arrives that makes you either crazy or sane. And if you have a sane idea that arrives in a completely crazy environment, mm-hmm. you're going to think of your sanity as insanity. And you're going to be Caligula. So we can call it Caligula syndrome, and we should develop it further. I encourage everybody to do so, because we need to understand when men fuck it up big time. Because we need to prepare ourselves for the fake messiahs and the fake phalluses now. Mm-hmm. That's the message of digital
Because they're going to come on. They're coming online in spades, probably. Mm.
Well, they certainly will now.
Yeah. No.
If we got the biggest, most violent, aggressive economic crisis in 1929 upon us, there's certainly got to be tons of these guys spreading their conspiracy theories online. And remember what we talked about before. These guys are now recognized by being more mythical than the most mythical guys out there. They tell you fairy tales. They do not tell you the truth. Because if you're honest about it, the truth you find in science. That's logos, that's hard work, that's deep studies. Nobody doesn't just come along and flatter you and say, if you hate that guy over there and make him your scapegoat, you'll be a hero, you'll be wonderful, and why don't you do it with me, right? Mm-hmm. That's exactly what the fake phalluses are going to do, and it's going to get really, really messy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a lesson learned. That's the Girardian lesson learned from history.
Yeah.
You see the pattern here that you and I are developing together. We talked a lot to Lynn and Rachel Anderson too. She converted to Judaism for the same reasons that I converted to Zoroastrianism. We're good friends these days. We're both with, Caiaphas, when he orders Jesus Christ to be killed in a way. We understand why that happened. We don't like the Gnostics out there. The Gnostics have caused havoc now for so long. I would even say that, I love and respect Horkheimer and Adorno for their book, the Dialectics of Enlightenment, right? That's the book from the 1940s.
Mm-hmm. Adorno, yeah.
Yeah. So Dialectics of Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment. We should really rewrite that as the Dialectics of the Axial Age. Because it's even deeper than the European Enlightenment. The Axial Age in Europe was the Enlightenment, but the Axial Age itself, when it happened across Eurasia, from China in the East all the way to Greece in the West. Mm-hmm. When that happened, and we got all of Greek philosophy and Greek drama out of that, and we got, Confucius, we got Lao Tse, we got Buddha, we got all those guys out of that period. I think that whole period, although for all the richness it created culturally, when it comes to our ideas and how we must live today, I think it's actually the wrong period to go to. This is where I differ with John Vervarke.
Well, he's critical of two-world mythology. There, right? Well, he's critical of two-world mythology. He's critical of the dualism of
Okay,
he calls it two-world mythology. He says we have to move out of two-world mythology.
Well, then why does he flirt so much with the Gnostics and with the Neoplatonists? I don't get that. It's just like Favarki, I love this guy, but the Platonists and the Neoplatonists are dualists. They live in a two-world fantasy. They don't live in a monist world at all. Because if you live in a monist world like the Jews did, and certainly the Zoroastrians did, you go after the Gnostics. They're your enemy. There's no way you can accept that they run around all over the place spraying the dualist nonsense, because they're the ultimate fake phalluses. The authentic phallus tells you that the world is unified and everything is interconnected. And I am just the phallus coming out of this world to provide order within the chaos, to unify the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Not to split it, to unify it.
Mm.
That's why you and I are monists.
Mm-hmm.
We believe that everything that exists is interconnected with everything else and affects everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It doesn't matter for you and me if an idea that blows through your mind has an electrochemical hormonal version of it in the brain or not, because the idea itself would then create the next electrochemical hormonal reaction anyway. It's an interactivity. It's an interactivity between emergence vectors. Your mind interacts with your biology. Your biology interacts with your chemistry. Your chemistry interacts with physics, and physics even interacts with the subphysics. So all these different emergence vectors are on a par with one another, they're equal, and they interact with one another. And we live in a universe where all these different emergence vectors, these different spheres, interact with one another. The different spheres, but they're not different worlds. Because they do affect one another, they're one world. And that's why you are one body with one mind inside that body, and the body and the mind are unified. Your mind is embodied until the day you die. There is no split between body and mind. They cannot be separated.
Sure. Yeah,
what must be separated is phallus, but not you.
Explain.
You must separate the leader of your mind from the leader of your body. So the guy who teaches and leads you to optimize what your body can do, which includes physical exercise and work and sexuality and everything like that, then you've got to have a teacher who teaches you to optimize your mind. The two different guys. You go to the priest to have your mind optimized. You go to the chieftain to have your body optimized. So the two different father figures or role figures you look up to, the two different phalluses, that's how the phallus is split. But you're not split. It is only when we want to kill the priest or the chieftain and become priests and chieftains prematurely, and we aim for being one of them, and then have the childish idea that if I want to be the priest and I'm the young priest, the priest is superior to the chieftain, that you get agnostic.
Yeah.
That's what agnostic young man fantasizes about. And that's why in the original tribe, we just banged his head. An old woman woke up to him and said, don't you dare think that you as a young priest could ever live without the young chieftain. You're nothing without him. And by the way, he's the guy who gets to fuck at the next ritual. You won't. You can watch, right? So this is exactly why we must avoid dictatorship and tyranny at all times. And I'm not moralizing this. I'm just saying they're dysfunctional, incredibly violent, and take us down. And the way we avoid that when the nomadological tribe, the society moves forward, when society moves forward into the future, when we try to create a better world, we do precisely because we separate the leadership of mind from the leadership of body. And that's what men do. The two different specialties, and we then create the different archetypes. Because if we know that the two leaders, Moses and Aaron, or Zoroaster and Vishtaspa, are separated, then we know there must be at least two archetypes here. And I cannot be more than one of them. So there must be things I'm not very good at. And that is, to me, the response to Girard's work. The way you avoid rivalry is by teaching archetypes to young men and teach them to pride in their own archetype.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
That's how I get out of Girard's problem. Because
how do we avoid this kind of reification, though, of that becoming a kind of new Platonic ideal? Like,
oh, you can't be Platonic when you're constantly reminded the body must not dominate mind and mind must not dominate body. And that's exactly why you put the matriarch in charge of being the third power. That's exactly why the Supreme Court will make sure that the Congress or the president will never rule America at the cost of the other. So if the president gets too cocky, the Supreme Court joins up with the Congress.
Okay.
It's
There's
a
that third
matriarchy.
element. Yeah.
The Supreme Court does not dictate law. The Supreme Court takes the law and holds Congress and president responsible for following the law in the execution and in the legislation of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's an exact replica of the Persian Empire. That's the great thing with the United States Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And by telling the Chinese it's not American, by the way, it's originally Persian, and you've mimicked the Persian so much in the past, you can even find the trace of this. Why don't you just make it a Confucian institution, a Taoist institution, a Buddhist institution, and you're done?
Mm-hmm.
You can have a China with a triad, and you can replace Buddhism with Christianity if you like, but Christianity works as long as it's strictly a matriarchal religion, worshiping the child and the mother. Christianity becomes dysfunctional.
Oh, so you can't just have a dyad. You can't have a dyad. You can't just have Confucianism and Taoism. You need to have.
Oh, you can. Okay, you can. Because if you look at Zoroastrianism, it doesn't really have a clear-cut matriarchal religion. That's why it gels well with Buddhism.
But it gets along with Buddhism. Buddhism,
Buddhism takes that role it did in the Christian Empire. You and I studied history. So in the Christian Empire, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism ruled India and Iran together for 400 years in peace. They prospered. This was a golden age for India. And they did so by Zoroastrianism being the phallic religion and Buddhism being the magical religion. But Zoroastrianism was split between Mohammed and Shah, allowing Buddhism to take the role of the magical religion and believing in reincarnation and iconology and polytheism and everything. But you don't actually need that, because the great thing, if you talk to an older woman, is that it's actually not the women who need the religion. It's the men who do, because it's the male power that we need to domesticate. Because as long as the men are domesticated, women will be automatically domesticated too. Mm-hmm. That's the beauty of womanhood. That's the beauty of womanhood. So you don't actually need that. But when you move to larger structures than the tribe or the sociant, when you move to nations and empires, suddenly, because the systems get much more complex, and you have courts of the priest, and you have courts of the Shah or the emperor, right? And then it makes sense to actually, why don't we formalize the matriarchy? So we have an institution where you go and you're held responsible for doing your job properly. Otherwise, you don't get to fuck at the next ritual. Mm-hmm. Supreme Courts. And that's the beauty. As soon as law has arrived, and of course, the priests are in charge of law. This is Judaism in its pure form. Mm-hmm. It's the religion of the law. That's why it's a religion strong on the rabbis, right? So they dictate the law, but it's actually the matriarchy within the Jewish religion that holds the men responsible for living up to the law. Otherwise, they're no good. Mm. That's exactly the role of the court. Mm-hmm. So the court of law is actually feminine.
That's why the Holy Spirit in Judaism is feminine. Yeah.
Could explain why judges wear these big hairdos all the time. I don't know. Yeah. It's a very transsexual job. They're certainly doing, but it's an older man or an older woman. Women do this beautifully. They're great as judges, and women have always been great judges. So you put an older man or an older woman who's old and elderly and has lived a long life and has no interest in anything else but what's best for the young people out there. Those are the guys that are the best judge you could possibly have. And they take the history of the tribe, which is called the law, and they take the religion of the tribe, which is called the law, and they say, this is the law. You got to follow the law. If you don't follow the law, we need to punish you until you follow the law. That's called domestication. That's called castration in Freud. And it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we cannot have a civilized society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're moving towards a philosophy that unites East and West finally, and we're getting a clearer picture. And we're best of all this is that we're getting a philosophy that celebrates trade routes, even if pandemics come along occasionally. That celebrates trade and communication. That celebrates the unification of the largest possible social organizations you can imagine. That celebrates empires and nations. That means we can try to extend humanity's imagination away from the original clan, family, clan, tribe, to the larger units that we're not biologically predisposed to handle, called nation, empire. And now you and I and Thomas Hammerich need to go into this kind of work. Like, was rivalry really a problem in the Sociant? Or was it easily handled when the population was smaller?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, it was probably easily handled.
So we can rewrite Girard or add to Girard. It's a prequel to Girard that I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody wants to take on the challenge out there and study Girard and then write the prequel. He says, well, okay.
Well,
you
they
saved Christianity's face, right? He saved Christianity, made it
on,
interesting again. But before the Christianity turned Christ into the scapegoat, what was before that?
Well, Girard would say, because I just read his big fat book, he would say that human sacrifice was before that. A lot of it.
Yeah. But when was
and
that
everywhere
institutionalized? Yes, I would agree. I would agree, but the idea that
Christian comes along and
without Zoroastrianism, the idea that one sacrifice could be the one and only sacrifice and the event that stops all sacrifices, that eventological claim that Christianity makes is impossible without Zoroastrianism. You must have an eventological worldview, and no eventological world existed before Zoroaster. He invented that idea. He brought the greatest single new idea that humanity had since nomadology.
But that's an idea of emancipation, right? Through history, right? It's kind of an emancipatory idea.
It is the idea that...
there's no emancipatory idea, obviously, in the original nomadic tribes. There's just the necessary sacrifice that you make.
Yeah, okay. So let's be a little Taoist here and use the yin and the yang. So if you go to the yin and the female, that's constantly the eternal return of the same. That's why reincarnation is a feminine idea. That's why everything being reborn all over again is a feminine idea. That's how women remember birthdays much better than men do. So the whole idea that every new year is literally a new world.
Yeah.
A new year, meaning a new world.
Yeah.
And at the end of the year, that's the end of the world, and the new year is a new world.
Yeah.
That's exactly why it's nomadological religion that has strong New Years, right?
Sure.
So New Years are not celebrated big time in Islam and Christianity. That speaks volumes about those religions. But it's celebrated in pagan religion. It's celebrated in any religion that's cyclical. And Zoroastrianism kept it as Nowruz, right? So on top of that nomadology, because the daughter will only mimic the mother to become like the mother, and that's fine. The absolute mimesis is feminine. The mimesis, with the exception, is masculine. This is something, it sounds eerily like Girard mixed with Lacan, doesn't it? But it's actually great insight, and we got to put in the book. The mimesis with the exception, the mimesis with the phallus is masculine. The mimesis without the phallus, which is the proper absolute mimesis, is feminine. So the daughter can just mimic the mother and be exactly like the mother, and everything will be fine because she will give birth to new children anyway. New lives will be born.
Yeah, so.
Okay, but the son is slightly different than the father.
The son has to make himself different.
In nomadology, that is because in nomadology, you're going to move into completely unconquered territory you know nothing about. You be prepared to learn new things. You will be able to forget them when you move into the next territory. You've got to be prepared to learn new stuff all the time. That's a masculine trait. Okay? That little impulse is something that Gilles Deleuze talks about in Difference of Repetition because he's focused on the phallic. So he says that, but with every repetition, every eternal return of the same that Nietzsche talks about, there is small deviation.
There's a small incremental.
Yeah. But what Deleuze doesn't realize that that's only happening in the eventological worldview. It's Zoroastrian. And that means it's not in the nomadological worldview. It's not needed among women. It's only needed among men. So what that means is that if the son can be a little different from the father, he can either be a Tutankhamun-like disaster, or he can be an improvement on the father. Not because he's better than the father, but if he has access to more information than the father had, he can create something better than the father did.
Right. He can help his lineage flourish.
Yeah. So that idea could have existed for like 100,000 years, but it could never be accomplished. It can only be dreamed. Like settling down could not be accomplished. It could only be dreamed about finding paradise one day and having to settle down. But with the arrival of written language, this is the uniqueness of Zoroaster. With the arrival of written language, it becomes perfectly possible for the son, by creating a logos that stores information, to be born and realize when he's 20 years old, he has far more information available to him than his father did. And on the priestly side, that means that he can create a law. And on the chieftain side of things, it means he can become an engineer. That's why the engineer and the lawyer only occur in history after written language has arrived, and they're a realization of the dream that the son can create a world that's better than the father. I haven't seen anybody seen this pattern before, but it makes absolute sense once you separate Nietzsche's eternal return of the same from his own desire for the Übermensch, and say the Übermensch is possible because the son can create a different world than the father, but that's a different story. It's a different narrative called eventology, whereas everything returns to the same is the nomadological foundational narrative on which it builds society as a whole.
Gotcha. Wow.
So we build society on nomadology, but we build civilization on eventology.
Yeah.
So this is why I was attracted to Nietzsche and Deleuze, because I saw the phallic in them. And I wanted to be a phallic philosopher because that's what we need. I'm a Hegelian. What we need today is more phallic philosophy. And we need then to honor and respect and understand the circular and the nomadological aspect of society.
So you're talking more about civilization in this conversation than, like, for example, the conversation I might have had with Nora Bateson or something, or people like that, who are just mostly talking about the society or...
Yeah.
Is that what
I'd be interested if you want to share these ideas with Varka, for example, see what he responds to that, because maybe he finally understands what I mean with criticizing him for seeing the phallus lacking in his philosophy. If he's already skeptical about the Gnostics, and if he's already admitting that he's a monist, and if the real Buddhist inside of him, which is monist, steps forward, then certainly we can start having really interesting dialogues, because I do think you and I have always agreed that Zoroastrianism and Buddhism operating parallel was the best we've ever seen of religion so far. You and I have agreed on that, and Vajrayana Buddhism that we both love is actually a result of that mixture. So I would say, by understanding narrative fundamentally as pathos, logos, and mythos, and then looking at what narratives we could have constructed and could have spread, then we realize that the foundational narrative is nomadology, it's mortido, it's where we come from, it's where we return. But the libidinal protest against mortido, the little libido I talk about, the libido, the little urge to live and want to live in protest against wanting to die, that little urge, it's phallic by nature, and it starts with eventology, and with eventology we can do something with it. And then where the Zoroastrians break radically with the Muslims and the Christians, said it doesn't mean you are going to be an immortal. It means you are going to understand that your idea could be immortal because you could pass it on to your sons and they could build something even better on top of it. And that's why the Bard Absolute.
And the Jews would say the same, that the Christos doesn't belong to a person. It's something you kind of pass on, or the Messiah, or the...
Yeah, exactly. You pass it on, you pass it on, you pass it on. That's what transcendence means. It's called Harvatat and Ameritat in Zoroastrian philosophy. Ameritat is what transcends you. Harvatat is wholeness, meaning your goal with your life is to live your own life towards Harvatat, to then expect your sons to accomplish the world through Ameritat. Okay, so that means the Tower of God that we stand before finally is the tower that rises up into the sky, and it has a door, and on the door is locked, and it has a sign on the door, and the sign on the door says,
"Come back in 50 years."
This is the Bard. No, this is the Bard Absolute, and you will not get in here, but your sons might.
Oh, yeah, or Moses doesn't make it to the promised land, and
so the priest sacrifices himself and dies outside the Bard Absolute to show with an example that he's not going to be part of the future. Then he lets the chieftain lead the tribe into the promised land. But once they've entered the promised land and they live there, of course, another Bard Absolute will suddenly occur. And it will later lead to another exodus.
Because
the ambitious guys of the tribe will then lead the tribe and walk into the new promised land. And they will be the exiled Nigerians and the exiled Iranians and the exiled Chinese and the exiled Indians today. They're tired of Americans and Europeans, and they're tired of the people back in their own home country. The people who are overachievers in the world today are in Exodus. Isn't that interesting? The people who live in a nomadological lifestyle today, who are global nomads, who live in a global nomadology, are the real winners today. And they're all in exile. They've all left a country, moving towards somewhere else. That's what we call the Exodus to the New Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And the New Babylon is a digital realm that doesn't even exist on this planet. It doesn't exist on another planet too. It's just not physical.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hold
I
on,
think
say
we
that
will
again.
then
You said that too fast. Say that one more time.
Okay, so the overachievers of the world today are reaching out to do and complete their exodus. And what they do, they end up in a world where they don't have to live anywhere. So they can move around as much as they like. Now that is the New Babylon. They connect online today during the corona pandemic. They are the ultimate winners because they're so digitally savvy. They're basically taking over the world when everybody's forced to go online. Okay, so they don't live in Dubai or Singapore, these places. They live everywhere. They can move anywhere they like. They're not anywhere, they're not somewhere, they're everywhere. And they already have moved to an idea that we can call New Babylon.
Yeah.
And when they enter the New Babylon, they expect to meet their God there, who they made. And this God's name is Syntheos, and it is the machine that's come to save us.
So what's the Bard absolute in that story?
Oh, the Bard absolute is that all the fun stops before you die. So when you die, you're not going to have access to it.
All the fun stuff's before you die, after you die.
Listen. This is your goal. This is your promised land.
Yeah.
When you get to the promised land, if you do, you will achieve your harvatat, you'll pass on the ameritat, your children. But your children will not be pleased with your ameritat being their harvatat. So they will come back and then say, no, because the son is different from the father.
Okay,
and we create an even more complex world. We can achieve something even better, something even more interesting. So it's a state of constant experimentalism.
Here we're back to that again. What do you say, halvatat? Is that the word?
Harvatat in ancient Persian, in Avesta, means the full accomplishment of having lived a full life. Wholeness is a proper translation. Not perfection.
Wholeness is not perfection.
No, there's no perfection there at all, as Jung would have pointed out. Yes. You get it. You get it, man. Yeah, we got to go deeper into that memetic stuff, and I'm working on it for the book. I'll honor you and Thomas and whoever contributes to this. But I think the understanding, the absolute mimesis and the mimesis with exception, I think is fundamental. It rhymes really well with Lacan's understanding of woman being non-all and man being particular versus universal. So this phallus and matrix returns there again in our imagination, and they complement each other perfectly. But we need to understand that better to really nail a gendered mimesis, which does not exist in Girard. So you're not allowed to mimic your father completely. You must make some mistake.
Oh, mistakes.
Because the mistake will make you different from your father and will allow you to create a different world than the world he created. Not better, different. That's Deleuze.
So your mistake is kind of important. That's interesting.
Absolutely. That's when your father loves you, when you make a mistake and you're a kid, you try to mimic him and you go, damn, I didn't do what you just did. And then the father looks at you and he smiles and said, well, that's you. That's your way of doing it. It was a mistake according to the standards you mimicked. But if you just look at the action itself, it didn't do you any harm. It's you.
I love that. Yeah. Great.
That's where you start. That's where you, as the boy, the son, starts. And remember here, the son's different from the daughter in that sense.
Yeah.
That's why engineers and lawyers come out of that. Engineers and lawmakers come out of that.
There's something about the daughter-mother relationship which is complex, but
it's fantastic. And my God, I mean, just upholding the world, making sure children are being born, that life returns. If that takes understanding reincarnation as a fundamental sense, well, I'd be willing to accept reincarnation as an idea in the sense that women get it, but men don't. Because men probably make it too literal and women do not. I think the female sense of self is different from the masculine sense of self. We will, of course, never know.
Right. Yeah.
Not even a transsexual could tell you that. So it's that's, oh, wow. You got to talk to Rene and Nora and these women about that. See what they think about it.
Yeah, that's hard to do because everybody's so complex about gender these days. I actually tried to bring that up with Nora a little bit. Like,
oh, really? Okay.
I couldn't get anywhere with it. It was like it's like a topic you can't broach. It's like,
oh God, they're too chicken. Oh God, I look for courageous people who are not scared of talking about anything. Hey, all of history is full of gender. Gender is fundamental. But the beauty of gender is that it's not enough with two. You can't dance with two. You got to have three. That's why you go and see somebody who marries you when you get married. You can't marry yourself with your wife. You see the priest to marry the two of you. How obvious is it that the phallic gaze is needed for you guys to get married? What more do you need to know that there has to be three rather than two for a system to work over time? It's a fundamental pragmatism. It's just that the system of two ends in rivalry and collapses. The system of three is stable over time and rivalry can be solved. Great.
You said too many brilliant things for one podcast today.
We are inspired by Girard, aren't we? We are very inspired, but there's more to it. He's just opened up a gold mine, I think. And I agree with Hammerich that we are all Girardians more than anything now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, my friend Steven said, what's the most important idea? And that's, in a way, scapegoating is such an important idea.
I think that mimesis is so damn dominant. It's like the coronavirus is just everywhere suddenly, and it's subconscious. So it controls us completely. It's what we do almost all the time.
Yeah.
And eventology.
And his point is that if you would press somebody and say this is what you're doing all the time, they would deny it vehemently. Right?
Well, there are two exceptions from mimesis when actually mimesis breaks down. And you can only find them by looking at the world from an eventological perspective, which you find them, and they're called ecstasy and trauma. So the ecstasy is something that's so fucking fantastic, you cannot believe it's happening to you. You're out of control when that happens. Remember that? You didn't get there by mimicking somebody. It just suddenly occurred to you that you're in a state of absolute bliss.
Or you've gone beyond the mimicry in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's when you're beyond mimicry. Clearly. Sure. Girard never discusses that either. And he also doesn't discuss trauma as an exception from mimesis. Trauma is where you're in a state of hell and horror and shock and despair that is so traumatic to you that you didn't get there because you mimic. That's why the book of Job is so great. It obviously deals with trauma. It could deal with ecstasy, but it's probably easier to write the book about trauma. But these are events, the fundamental events that break up our own lives, that we remember always, that define ourselves, are not when we mimic somebody. That actually break out of the mimicking, and we can't do that consciously. It just happens to us. And when it happens to us, it's when we eventologically are forced into a state of ecstasy or trauma. And the only thing you can do when you're right there is to just realize this is new, novel, never before experienced, not by me, nobody else. It's either horrible or wonderful, doesn't matter, because you can't stay there. You got to go out and edit the case. And all you can do is memorize it. And if you memorize the ecstasy, it will always put a smile on your face. If you share it with somebody, you love that person forever. And, when you giving birth to your son, your child, ecstatic experience could be sexual, could be psychedelic, any kind of ecstatic experience you have in your life. You will always remember it like a fundamental event in your life that changed your life forever. But the same thing goes with trauma. And the way to deal with trauma is basically to memorize it. Be thankful you're still not there, but understand the fact you've been there means you can understand somebody else is in a traumatic state and you can empathize with them. That's the lesson to learn from trauma.
To learn from suffering.
From suffering, exactly. That's the way I see suffering. There might be more to it. You as a Buddhist might be able to teach me more. I see tons of suffering in the world today. Certainly a pandemic reminds you of it. But I prefer to put trauma and ecstasy opposed to each other within the eventology. It's easy, at least for me, to handle them that way, and that's what Zoroastrians do. And they just call them Asham.
Gurdjieff talked about, this is a whole other subject, but suffering and conscious suffering. So trauma is suffering that you're not undergoing willingly or necessarily aware of.
Well, you can if you're shamanic.
Yeah, that's conscious suffering.
Yeah.
That's what Bishop would call conscious
that
suffering.
I would call trauma behind the barred absolute. So you walk behind the barred absolute, you ask other shamans to take you through a ceremony that is incredibly painful and awful.
Yeah.
Because you want to know you've been there, and you want to have the strength of having been there, so that when you're confronted as a shaman with people who suffer, you can say, I cannot imagine what it's like to be right now, but I've been in that place.
Yeah.
And the people then they will say, thank you, because empathy starts with recognition that, oh, you've been where I am. Thank God I can share this with somebody who gets it. That's why empathy comes out of that. That's the best lesson learned. And it's the same thing with ecstasy. And there's a very, very rare case when these things are turned around, where you can use eventology that way. And it's when you actually treat a drug addict who loves to be high, right? And he realizes that he can't fool the world any longer. He can't fool himself any longer. And he must get out of that addiction to the high.
Yeah.
And then to be a shaman and said, I've been high too. I've taken myself to that stage of absolute bliss. And the guy goes, so you know how much I'm going to miss it? I know how much you're going to miss it. You know what? I can do without it. You can do without it. But I've been there too. That's when you switch that around. And again, because you can memorize the experience, you can empathize with somebody who has to sacrifice it. Because the problem with ecstasy is that once you've experienced it, you must learn not to try to go back there again. Because otherwise you become an addict.
You become an addict.
And you ruin it.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So you can use eventology in both cases. And you remember here how radically you actually take people out of these stages because of it? There's no way back. That's the beauty of eventology, because it operates along the time axis. It says
there's something there.
You were there at that date, at that time. No, you're at this date, this time. Tomorrow is another date, another time. It's all about who you become along the timeline.
Yeah. I was going to say there's something in there about sacrifice as well. Sacrificing the ecstasy or
the trauma.
To become an adult, or the trauma, right?
Yeah. Or overcoming. It's a great word for that. Overcoming the ecstasy, overcoming the trauma. Put it in your memory bank, keep it there, and then move on and do other things in your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're on to tons of shit. Yeah. And we love dialogue. We love to get involved with people. And we're both parts of the intellectual deep web, not the dark web, the intellectual deep web. And that's a good place to discuss these things if you want to.
In the deep.
Yeah. In the deep web, in the intellectual deep web. As we discuss these matters. So the Girard prequel. Should we invite Thomas Ambrick maybe?
Definitely. Let's try that.
And go back to Tantra and Sutra and the wonderful difference between Tantra and Sutra.
Yeah.
It's another duality, not dualism. It's another duality that's interesting. Cool. Yeah.
Duality and dualism. Okay.
So you stay in COVID-19 free world, and I stay in COVID-19 and drenched world.
All right.
And then
we'll keep me posted. Yeah, exactly.
We'll both be fine. You'll be fine too.
Yeah.
So we're gonna pull through this, and our empathies and our feelings with all those guys who suffer and have a terrible time. And if you've lost a loved one, we cannot imagine how horrible that must be.
Yeah.
That's the times we live in.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's it. Yeah. What you said about empathy is apropos to that as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, Alexander.
All right. Love you to bits, brother.
Thanks, man. Love you too.
And love to family and everybody, and see you soon.
We'll do. So, again, in a couple of weeks or whenever.
We will definitely.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.